Because when you don't have a rule of three, that doesn't happen. You can look at the airline industry in the US when we had 8 or 10 major airlines. They were all competing viciously with each other. We had overcapacity, right? We had customers confused with choice. We had a lack of investment in customer care. We had employees who were getting squeezed. I mean, nobody was happy, right? Investors lost more money in the airline industry than in any other industry, probably. Employees were constantly going on strike. Customers hated all the airlines, right? So because you just had, there's this belief about competition that competition is good and therefore more competition is better and extreme competition is best. But actually it turns out that there are some negative aspects when you have too much competition. Nobody can survive, nobody can make money.
That led to the whole evolution as to how many generalists are there and what's the market share. And it turns out that there are always 3 generalists. If there are only 2, a third evolves. If there are 4, the fourth dies or third dies. Very fascinating. And in the long run, specialists take over the market from the generalists, and generalists take over the market from the specialists, which led to the whole research.
Generalists are created equal. He said Coca-Cola, for example, is very strong in the center of the market, very strong. Whereas General Motors, another generalist, is very strong in the high end of the market with Cadillac, and it is very strong in the low end of the market with Chevrolet, but it is not doing so good. So maybe there is something in that you should look into. So that was basically his point and question, the challenge for us.
It was done from a shopping mall. Suddenly you get this aha moment, the world is explained to you, kind of stuff. Now what has changed since that time are about 3 things. Again, rule of 3. Everything in life is a rule of 3. People simply say, you can't think beyond 3rd dimension of anything in life. And I say, that's fine, it's okay.
He's a Charles Kelstad Professor of Business at Goizueta Business School, Emory University, Atlanta. He wrote his first book, Theory of Buyer Behavior, way back in 1969. And he has spent more than 35 books and 300 articles. And he has also written his autobiography, Accidental Scholar. Anybody who wants to know about his life can go there and check out on Accidental Scholar. Welcome, Professor Sheth. Our next speaker is Professor Raj Sisodia, who is FW All-in Distinguished Professor of Global Business at Babson College, Wellesley. He has authored many books. Notable among them is Forms of Endearment, Rule of 3, 4 is of Marketing, Tectonic Shift. All these books he has co-authored with Dr. Jagdish Sheth. And thereafter, he also penned his book, Conscious Capitalism, along with John Mackey, who is the CEO of Whole Foods. Our third author is Professor Can Uslay. His core area is about marketing and strategy and theory construction. He has co-authored books like Relationship Marketing, Reimagined with Professor Naresh Malhotra, and Deregulation and Competition, Lessons from Airline Industry with Professor Jagdish Sheth. Our moderator for the evening, Mr. Indrajit Gupta, he was the founding editor of Forbes India edition, and within 4 years, Forbes became the topmost leading business magazine in India while he was at the helm of the affairs. He is also co-founder and director of Founding Fuel. He has interviewed many top business and thought leaders, including C.K. Prahlad, Ram Charan, Nitin Noria, Sumantra Ghoshal, Carlos Goshen, and many more. Now I'll just give you some context why we are having this launch of the Global Rule of 3 over here. Dr. Sheth and Dr. Raj Sisodia co-authored the Rule of 3 original book in 2002, and it was converted into a TV serial by CNBC Asia as a 7-part TV serial. In 2003, again, Dr. Sheth and Dr. Raj Sisodia joined hands and come out with Forms of Endearment, How World-Class Companies Profit from Passion and Purpose. In 2014, Raj Sisodia wrote Conscious Capitalism, and thereafter, John Mackey was sold out for this book, and he sold his business and put all his money for the cause of conscious capitalism. And Raj Sisodia and John Mackey are now, they have established Conscious Capitalism Institute, and they are taking it worldwide as a movement. In 2020, this year, the Global Rule of 3 has come out, which is integrating conscious capitalism substance as a strategy. So this is where the journey from 2002 to 2020. If you are a numismatic person, you can relate to it that it is all about digit 2 and digit 0. So first it was 2002, today it is 2020. I don't know whether it is going to be a lucky number for all the three authors. It is going to be definitely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jayant. Thank you, Professor Chaturvedi, for the very warm and kind words. And it's truly a privilege for me to be anchoring this conversation with Dr. Sheth, Jagdish Sheth, Professor Raj Sisodia, and John Uslay. I've known Professor Sheth for now over 2 decades. I've known Raj Sisodia and his work on conscious capitalism, and I've got to know John Uslay more recently. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation because, as Professor Chaturvedi mentioned, the contribution that each of them have made to the advancement of management thought and ideas is phenomenal. So, and this is an important piece of work, given the fact that we're emerging out of perhaps what has been an unprecedented year in 2020, with hopefully much more renewed hope as we look forward to 2021. So this is an important conversation where we get an opportunity to listen to three really superb scholars and learn from that experience. So very quickly, there are 3 sections that we're going to kind of cover. First, in section 1, I will request the 3 co-authors to really help us understand the context for this new work, the Global Rule of 3. Because as we heard, the first book, which was did extremely well, Rule of 3, came out in 2002, almost a decade, 2 decades have passed since then. So we'll try and understand the past and what has happened since then that will help us connect with the present. So that's section 1. Section 2 is to really understand the work that has gone into the Global Rule of 3 research and what that's thrown up and what sort of strategic choices does it leave for different kinds of businesses, the businesses that are among the top 3 generalists, the ones that are specialists, and those that fall in the middle, what the 3 co-authors call being in the ditch. So ditch dwellers as well. So that's a section that we will try and understand a little more deeply from them, what the research really tells us. The final one is very simple. We're obviously interested as practitioners and as thought leaders, academicians, in terms of what are the implications of the Global Rule of 3? What does it mean for us as leaders in business and academia, right? How do we position our business? How do we compete? So given the fact that all 3 of them do work with organizations and also develop research to try and kind of shape management thought, it'll be useful for us to really spend some time in section 3 to really understand what the important implications are so that we can get our heads around that. So with that as the context, I'll drive straight in and come to you, Professor Sheth. I know a lot has changed in the 2 decades since Raj and you wrote the Rule of 3 in 2002. Tell us a little about how what has really changed, and for the benefit of people who may not necessarily know everything about the Rule of 3 and the Global Rule of 3, if you could give us a short background as well and build on what has changed in the last 2 decades. Over to you, Professor Sheth.
Thank you, Indrajit. So nice to have you as a moderator. I admire all you have done at Economic Times, Times of India, and other places that we know each other. So thank you. The original idea of this Rule of 3, specialist and generalist, actually came when I was doing research for AT&T. One of the AT&T divisions was consumer products, and they had 1,800 retail stores, as opposed to coming to your home and installing the phones. Idea was that people come and it'll reduce the cost by $100 million. In that research, I went to look at Radio Shack. Radio Shack was one of those specialty for people who did the hobbies, built things on their own, and Radio Shack was the benchmark. So I went to a shopping mall. This is in the 80s roughly. I was at University of Southern California at that time. And I just realized that you had the Sears, JCPenney, or Macy's anchor department stores in a shopping mall, but you had all these specialty guys like Radio Shack or Foot Locker. And there were two kinds of specialists. Those who focused in a product category, like AT&T was a phone, everybody can buy that phone, the designer phones, before the cell phones came in. And then you had the market specialist, which focused on a given segment of the market, a lifestyle segment, and providing everything that they want. So I was surprised with that here is Sears Roebuck, which goes for value proposition primarily, competes on price and then maybe fast turnover. And here are the specialists both coexisting together, which immediately connected in my mind that you have two kinds of competitors. They don't compete in the short run, they coexist, but in the longer run, they might be competing. In economics, we have the theory of what you call oligopoly or cartels, right? Where there's a dominance by a few players. Then we also have a theory of monopolistic competition, which says through differentiation, you command higher rent or higher prices essentially in the marketplace. And they never connected the two together. So in a shopping mall, the idea came that you have every market, a few generalists, one-stop shop, and you have lots of specialty retailers. That led to the whole evolution as to how many generalists are there and what's the market share. And it turns out that there are always three generalists. If there are only two, a third evolves. If there are four, the fourth dies or third dies. Very fascinating. And in the long run, specialists take over the market from the generalists, and generalists take over the market from the specialists, which led to the whole research. And of course, those who neither have the differentiation advantage of a specialist nor the volume or scale advantage of the generalist fall in the ditch. It became more and more interesting. And I met Raj in 1991. And this book was supposed to be written before that while I was at USC. I was so busy. When Raj came in my life, and he's a brilliant, brilliant guy, he's an engineer, think about that one, who has studied primarily marketing and business. But if he was going into journalism, he would have got the Pulitzer Prize anytime. He's just brilliant. I mean, having the talent of somebody who is a great scientist at one time, but a great writer at the same time, it's just incredible journey we started together. And we finished the book Rule of Three pretty much in the process. So that's the background. It was done from the shopping mall. Suddenly you get this aha moment, world is explained to you kind of stuff. Now what has changed since that time are about three things. Again, rule of three. Everything in life is a rule of three. People simply say, you can't think beyond third dimension of anything in life. And I say, that's fine, it's okay. So first thing is technology has changed dramatically. Nobody imagined the impact of the internet even when we wrote the book. Raj and I have written several articles afterwards, but I think technology has been a major transformation in the world where through social media now, but just the internet and the World Wide Web, the world has become more global than ever before. Secondly, after the first energy crisis in 1970s, leading up to whole restructuring of the industries in the 80s, the only way to grow the economy was not on domestic markets, because they're all struggling from growth. That's why they changed the whole trading policy, basically following Ricardo's thinking, trade will create the economic stimulus. So liberalization of the trade took place, or globalization from the 90s. They created a WTO organization. Trade should be more free, no tariffs, no quotas, to the extent that there's no opportunism by some nation. So you go to the court like a WTO as arbitration place. So that led to globalization much faster, much sooner than ever before, which was another thing. Things were happening global, mostly through merger acquisitions, these big companies buying each other out across borders as opposed to within the border. And the third thing is the rise of emerging markets. Emerging markets, nobody figured out, but Raj and I wrote a book called Tectonic Shift, where we saw the pattern of emerging markets becoming dominant, Goldman Sachs also has a report, BRICS report as it is called. They were promoting the idea that emerging markets is the future. So that was a second major category. And the last one was the economic reforms in emerging markets. The traditional models of a socialism-based or a commanding heights, Lincoln's theory, Lenin's theory, for example, was abandoned for free markets, like in India, economic reforms in 91, China going through Deng Xiaoping, going from a communist to a capitalist society, creating additional economic reforms, which allowed other peoples to come in the market and grow the market essentially. I think those three things have been very remarkable. So we wrote the book, Global Rule of Three, and invited John Uslay. John is brilliant. I worked with John before, and it's just a joy. Like Raj, being a military guy at one time, doing other stuff in his life, he writes so well, and we work very well together. And John did a lot of work on the globalization side on this book. Long background, but I hope it's okay.
This is useful, Professor Sheth. So thank you for that. In fact, I wanted to kind of dive a little deeper to really understand how the three of you collaborated on this book. I know it took some time. You mentioned that to me when we were chatting about it before this session. But John, you want to come in at this stage to talk about your involvement, and I'll then go to Raj to hear his story as well on how this book took shape. And I know it took some time, so just give us your sense of your personal anecdotes, really, that might
Sure.
give us some sense.
Thank you, Indrajit, BIMTech, and everybody involved for the opportunity. So I guess the question is really, how come did you get so lucky to be able to work with these preeminent scholars? And that's a fair question. So I'll begin with the punchline, then I'll tell the story. So the punchline is, I was at the right place at the right time. Or rather, I can say that I was nearly at the right place at nearly the right time. So basically, here's the story. I was in the middle of my studies, my PhD studies at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, and I found out that Emory University was starting a PhD program in marketing, a brand new PhD program. So when you hear that Professor Sheth is offering a seminar in marketing, you find a way to take it. So I did. In fact, I had to interview to get into his class, but that's a separate story, but I managed. So I think it was a couple of months into the semester, Professor Sheth took about half an hour to discuss the rule of three. The book basically had just come out, but I got to hear the theory firsthand from the professor, and I was amazed. It was fascinating. It was simple, but yet so powerful. It had so rich implications, managerial implications, strategic implications, marketing implications, financial investment implications, the list goes on. So I was amazed by it. Alas, I couldn't do anything about it because my PhD topic was already set. And actually, I was fortunate that later on Professor Sheth served on my dissertation committee. But as he always said, of course, a good dissertation is a done dissertation. So I had to get that out of the way and publish my first few articles, but it was always in the back of my mind because nothing had been published in the top journals about this very powerful theory. So when it was time, I started to think more and more about it. In fact, I discussed it with my colleagues at my first institution. My colleague next door was in finance. So when I told her about the theory, she initially didn't believe me, right? There was some counterintuitive aspects to it. So her attitude was more like, in God we trust, but everybody else must bring data. And the problem is, when it comes to market share, the data is not widely available. So I remember going to Cal State libraries. I was in Orange County, Southern California at the time, looking at different reports. There's something called Market Share Reporter. I'll tell the journey because it may be of interest to the academics in the audience. And the data was coming from multiple various sources. It wasn't consistent, very patch-like, but it was enough to put together some initial preliminary analysis, which actually I presented in Informs Marketing Science Conference in Singapore. And it was kind of embarrassing because that's the conference where usually people use the latest cutting edge methodologies. And here I was using t-tests. But the paper was well received nevertheless because the results were so interesting. And also, more importantly, it was enough for me to convince my colleague next door. And as it turns out, she was actually quite the wizard in the CompuStat database that financial scholars often use. And the CompuStat database had, of course, public data available for sales of all publicly traded companies, as well as their financial performance in detailed, basically, aspects of it. And the other side, of course, you need industry level aggregate sales data to compute market share. And we found out that the US Census conducted such a survey, alas, every 4 years, but they did at least have something. So we were able to put together a rigorous empirical test of that. But we had a small hiccup. So usually in social sciences, when you have a bunch of hypotheses, it is very common and almost expected that one or few of them will not be supported. In our case, all of the hypotheses were supported very clearly. So we didn't take any chances. We actually used a number of dependent variables: return on assets, return on sales, 1 year return, 3-year return, 5-year return, cumulative abnormal stock market returns. We did use different definitions of markets, different operationalizations, different cutoff points, you name it, we did it basically. So then we wrote it up and submitted to the Journal of Marketing, which arguably is the top scholarly journal in the field of marketing. And by arguably, I actually mean, I know it to be true, but others can argue about it. So we submitted to the Journal of Marketing. And in the review process, I also thought of maybe I should, get some big name scholars so that it will help us in the review process. So I actually sent the manuscripts to 2 preeminent scholars. One was Glenn Carroll at Stanford University, and the other, which I'm amazed to read, that was Phil Cutler at Northwestern University. I sent the manuscript to them, and both of them gave a very favorable feedback, which was great. But then actually Phil Cutler, I'm not sure if you'll remember, but he also raised a very interesting question that stuck with me. And if somebody asks about it, if we have time later, I don't think we had a lot of time to address that in the article, but I think we did a good job of addressing it in the book. So he basically said, not all generalists are created equal. He said Coca-Cola, for example, is very strong in the center of the market, very strong. Whereas General Motors, another generalist, is very strong in the high end of the market with Cadillac, and it is very strong in the low end of the market with Chevrolet, but it is not doing so good. So maybe there is something in that you should look into. So that was basically his point and question, the challenge for us. Again, maybe we can address it later if the question is raised, but let me move on with the story. So the paper was published in the Journal of Marketing, and it also received some accolades. So it was the first runner-up for the Maynard Hunt Award, which is given to the paper that makes the most theoretical contribution to the field of marketing. And it was also the first runner-up for the MSI Paul Root Prize, which is given to the paper that makes the biggest contribution to the practice of marketing. And it is very rare for a paper to be able to basically recognize for both. So that gave us encouragement, obviously. So then I went to the Boston Consulting Group and asked for their support. So fortunately, they said yes, they provided financial support, but more importantly, they actually gave us access to the Capital IQ database, which included private firms as well as small firms that CompuStat database did not have. So everybody, and the predecessor of CompuStat was the PIMS database. All of these databases typically focus on very large conglomerates, large companies. So the left-hand side of the equation is usually omitted from the academic studies, unfortunately. But we were able to combine the 2 mega databases. It was a monumental effort, but the beauty of it is, as a result, we were able to go from a few thousand firms as a sample to almost 250,000 firm years from over 4 decades.
Wow.
And we also been brought in, of course, now we can do longitudinal analysis, right? We can bring in the heavy guns. And we also adopted a methodology called multivariate adaptive regression splines, also called MARS, which basically is a machine learning tool that can look at exact specific relationships of functional forms. So you can actually see where the specialist range ends, where the ditch begins, where the generalist range basically begins. And you can beautifully see that in the plots that this tool generates. So we basically worked on that paper. And subsequently, we also applied the rule of 3 using market share elasticities. Again, over and over, decade after decade, industry group after industry, it's the same result, very strong, very powerful, and it is there. So to recap, I was nearly at the right place at nearly the right time, but I should also, of course, thank my co-authors on the empirical side of the rule of 3 research. So Ayça Altıntı, my next door colleague of finance. She is now at Claremont Graduate University. And then Bob Windsor, who was actually a Professor Sheth student at University of Southern California. He's at Loyola Marymount University. Our methodological wizard, Kate Carnucina, who brought in the Mars technique. She's now dean at Mills College in Northern California in the Bay Area. And Martin Reeves from the Boston Consulting Group. He's actually senior partner and head of the Henderson Strategy Institute for the Boston Consulting Group. So I have to thank every one of them. And that is basically my story of how I got the.
This
I
is
did a
most
lot of extensive research in the area.
No, this is most useful, John, because you know, I think what you focused on are some very important themes, and which we would want to pick up in the last section, which is basically in terms of what it takes to build a research-based culture, right? And you spoke about networks, you spoke about collaboration, you spoke about looking at very strong empirical databases to bring the rigor and relevance that we seek from research, so that management really shapes practice, right? So these are very important things. So thank you for that. I'll move to Raj. Raj, I just want to draw you in here because we've known each other for a while now, and I know you spent the last almost 10, 12 years giving shape to the conscious capitalism movement. But you were, with Dr. Sheth, really the moving force behind the original rule of three. And you've witnessed a lot of some fairly interesting trends from your vantage point as the mover and shaker of the whole conscious capitalism movement, which we heard about. What would you kind of, what is your story on this book project? What would you define as the core purpose of the book and why it's important in today's context? Raj?
Yeah, so it was great to hear the background from John. I didn't know some of those details, but he has made a huge contribution, of course, to this work. My own involvement, I met Jack Sheth really for the first time in New Delhi at a marketing and economic development conference, where I was put in charge of a session with him and the diffusion of innovation person. I forget his name now. Oh, Everett Rogers. So we had an overflow crowd, and that's how we connected. And I do remember a scene from that conference where Phil Kotler debated with the Prime Minister, Chandrasekhar, because the theme of the conference was marketing and economic development. And we had a socialist prime minister at that time who said, why do we need marketing at all? So it was a fascinating time. And for me, I would say my real business education, even though I already had my PhD and MBA, it really started then as I started to work with Jag for the rest of that decade. I mean, I learned far more, in that process. And then we had this book project that we wrote a bunch of papers and other things, but Jag said, there's a book, and I had never written a book. And I said, oh God, I don't know if I can do that. That just seems like overwhelming, right? And I really had writer's block. And finally it came down to the deadline, and I was in Atlanta, and we just locked me in a room in Emory Inn for 3 weeks. And we managed to get about 80% of the thing on paper, so that's how it kind of started. And so it's really been a life-changing journey for me, of course, to be associated with Jack Sheth, as well as starting out on my journey of writing with that book. And then, as IG pointed out, my path subsequently, several years later, after Jag and I did Funds of Endearment, started to go more into that side, the human side of business, and all the work that has come there. But of course, we've always rooted it in the fundamentals of business as well. So business has to be people-centered, human-centered, good for people, good for the planet, good for the world. But also business has to function well as a business. And Funds of Endearment actually showed that as well, that we had companies that not only were loved by all of their stakeholders, but also outperformed the market dramatically, literally by a 9-to-1 ratio. And of course, the rule of three. Now, if I come back to the rule of three and kind of look at the interface between that and the whole conscious capitalism world, it really comes down to this, that the core purpose of business is to create value. And in the past, we've defined that too narrowly as financial value for shareholders, but now we say it's many kinds of wealth: financial, intellectual, social, emotional, spiritual, cultural, ecological, physical. I mean, business creates and destroys many kinds of wealth. And how can we set up business in a way, and how can we strategize in a way that maximizes the amount of wealth and the value really that we generate, and without causing the negative so-called externalities. And so that if we take that as a given that the purpose of business is to create as much value as possible for all stakeholders and do so efficiently and effectively in terms of resources, you can see where the rule of three then fits in. Because when you don't have a rule of three, that doesn't happen. You can look at the airline industry in the US when we had 8 or 10 major airlines. They were all competing viciously with each other. We had overcapacity, right? We had customers confused with choice. We had a lack of investment in customer care. We had employees who were getting squeezed. I mean, nobody was happy, right? Investors lost more money in the airline industry than in any other industry, probably. Employees were constantly going on strike. Customers hated all the airlines, right? So because you just had there's this belief about competition that competition is good and therefore more competition is better and extreme competition is best. But actually it turns out that there are some negative aspects when you have too much competition. Nobody can survive, nobody can make money. And this is a way of sorting it out and getting to some kind of an optimal structure where you have the right amount of competition so that you don't get monopoly type of behavior, no complacency. Customers have the right amount of choice. It fits into Jack's work on buyer behavior around the evoked set or the consideration set that people, and that's why Sears succeeded, right? Because they gave you three choices, good, better, best in every product category. So when you have three, that's when customers feel most comfortable, three clear alternatives, making a choice. So what the rule of three does, as we hypothesized and as John established through the research, it actually creates more value at the industry level overall, right? If you look at financial returns and other things, there's more value that is created. And it also reduces the likelihood of failures. If you are aware of this theory and you are part of that market, you're not going to do stupid things. You won't undertake suicidal strategies, right? So it reduces the likelihood and thus the social cost of failure. There's not just a business cost of failure. People's lives get upended and disrupted and a lot of wealth gets destroyed. So I believe it saves a lot of suffering. And I think another way I think about business now is business has to be an instrument of healing in the world. How can we reduce suffering and bring more joy into the world through business? And this is a way I think when we follow this, and that's why we have the subtitle Competing with Conscious Strategy. When you strategize in a conscious way, not just looking at short-term opportunistic returns, but looking at overall long-term value creation and the sustainability of that, then this really gives a lot of pointers and a lot of very, very clear guidance to that. And it also shows that business is a game in which there can be many, many winners, right? Traditional way of thinking is that there's one winner and everybody else has lost, right? But this shows that many paths to winning. In fact, numerous paths, if you look on the specialist side, and even on the other side, all of the generalists are really winning in their own game. So it's like defining your own game and winning at that in a way that connects to a set of stakeholders. And I think the last point is that there are some important policy consequences of this work. In terms of antitrust. Jag and I wrote a couple of op-eds in the Wall Street Journal about that, the consolidation of the auto industry, also the airline industry. And we were encouraging that, we should allow consolidation up to this point, right? Because up to this point, it's value adding. But when you get beyond this and you allow for consolidation beyond three major players, then it actually becomes problematic. So again, in terms of setting up antitrust structures, I think there are also some important implications of this.
Terrific. That was a really useful, kind of delineation of some of the important reasons why this book is important. Thanks for that, Raj. I want to close section one with Professor Sheth, really to probe a little more and very briefly, if you could help us kind of connect. What I love about the work on global rule of three is the fact that you've considered a lot of concepts that are fairly enduring. They're powerful, enduring concepts, starting with, of course, the original work done by Bruce Henderson in 1976, the rule of three, and starting there, and Michael Porter's work on strategy, and came out on globalization. Professor Sheth, what do you see as what were the enduring ideas in your mind that have stood the test of time, so that we don't run the risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Because sometimes we kind of rely on fads that come and go, but the really good ones don't necessarily die out that easily. your
Yeah.
quick comments on that.
Yeah. The first one is that despite the oligopoly and the rule of 3 or 4, as Henderson talked about, there is always an opportunity for a niche player. There's a segment in the market which is up for grabs, as for example, Toys R Us figured out from department stores. Book people did the same thing, B. Dalton and all those guys. So there is always an opportunity for an entrepreneur, not just to compete, but coexist. That's really one lesson.
Sure.
Second one that stood in my mind was number 3 company is always most innovative, game changer, not number 1 or number 2. Even though number 1, number 2 has very large R&D expenditure, it's number 3, which is so close to the ditch, it's its survival game. So when the number 1 and number 2 compete on price, usually when the industry is not growing to capture market share, number 3 goes in the ditch, which is a remarkable pattern across, I don't know, Raj and I did earlier, maybe 100 product categories, we saw the same pattern. So number 3 is the most innovative, not General Motors, not Ford, but Chrysler. Right. Not Coca-Cola or Pepsi, but RC Cola. Right. Not Boeing or, McDonnell Douglas, but Lockheed, in terms of bringing about a change either in technology or in marketing practices. That was another key factor. So in many ways, the book went way beyond the original thinking by people, either in economics, like Michael Porter, industrial organization, or in fact, Henderson. Henderson only talked about experience curve aspect primarily, which is how scale is important. And an experience curve will give you the advantage. Sure. Last thing, I'll take one more minute. Sure. Economies of scale concept was anchored toward manufacturing sector, industrial age. And they thought that's because of the value add we do in the factory. Value add in the factory today is less than 25%, maybe less than 10% in labor, 10% in capital, all factors of production, and 10% in management. It is now down to 27 or 25% worldwide. The real scale is not in manufacturing, what you do as value add, but in procurement. Procurement is a very key function, and procurement is the most corrupt function in every company. It is where you get the bribes from the customers. Customer wants to bribe you to get an unfair. So procurement has to become very strategic function, not production. Production, of course, has been there. Now we are thinking about the design, but procurement is a very key function because 60%, 70% is all procurement cost. Give you an example. In the PC business today, like HP, Lenovo, the value add in the factory is only 11%. 89% is all what you buy as components, out of which as much as 79% goes to Microsoft and Intel, where Microsoft still dominates. Intel is struggling with competition, essentially. The rest is all about, the dashboard or whatever you have in a PC, typically. So procurement is the one that I'm focusing quite a lot. What can you do with your suppliers to increase the value? I will stop talking because there are more questions.
No.
I do want to say, I'm so glad we have such great people in the audience. I just saw Philip Kotler,
yes,
pretty much. And Philip, as you know, is our mentor. Every book I have written, I've gone to Philip and Phil and say, Phil, please endorse it or tell me what do I do. And he has been a great friend and a partner for us and for Raj and now for Can Uslay, same way. So Phil is there. I saw Ram Charan probably also as a name that came up there pretty much. So it's great to have a great audience, yes.
Absolutely. It's a privilege to have all of you and the names that Professor Sheth you mentioned, Philip Kotler and Ram Charan, we've kind of grown up on the work that they've done. Extraordinary, truly extraordinary. So I will quickly move on to section 2. Before that, there is one question that I think Arup has raised, and I'll come to you, Professor Sheth. He's asked about, I think, the concept of value that some of the panelists, all of you have alluded to, and he wants to know whether that means value in use, or is there a different way of looking at value?
Yeah. My own personal view is that it is all value in use, which is where there's a very great synergy between a marketing department and an engineering department. You can create value in use, and there are many dimensions of those values. A functional value, which is what the R&D people think about. R&D people don't think about buyers, they think about users.
Yes.
And we have forgotten in marketing, we should be thinking about users. Selling is where one thinks about the buyer. I think we need to separate the two roles to separate marketing from selling. And therefore, that's one clearly is a functional value. How can you create a functional value where the product works or the service works as it promised? Second one, of course, is, and there are two dimensions of functional value and a psychological value, which is where marketing does a great job by associating with some personalities, for example, associating with situations. So we create value in use by association. Engineering creates value by designing it itself.
Sure, sure.
But the second value is very important, which is social value. So we have a second value, which is related to social, because products and consumptions have meanings and symbols to people in a positive way by contributing to the environment through my consumption, for example, like mindful consumption.
Yes.
So we are adding that as a value. The third and the key one, C.K. Prahlad talked about it so much, is affordability.
Yeah.
In many parts of the world, affordability and accessibility is a key problem. In America, even though it's a great nation, in healthcare, we have a huge access problem.
Right.
I'm trying to get a vaccine and nobody knows how do I get it. And we have a surplus of vaccine on the other side, you know?
Yes.
So the market access is a very important area. And those are the three key values: functional value, social value, accessibility, affordability. And last one I would add, I think for the first time, based upon Raj's thinking quite a lot, I think corporations have to take accountability. Raj and I wrote a book called 4 A's of Marketing.
Yes.
And one of the A's is really accountability. I mean, companies should stand up and basically say, I'm responsible, rather than use the court system to delay any judgment, pretty much. So to me, that's one more.
Terrific, terrific. So I'll thank you for that. That was brilliant. I mean, I'll move on to section 2, where we're trying to really go a little more deeper and really look at and unpack the research that has gone into the global rule of 3 and what it's telling us. And I'll go to you, John, to really help us pick maybe one favorite example from the industries that you've studied. Pick any one and tell us what are the patterns your research has kind of identified and what did you find? Maybe in a couple of minutes. Yeah.
So I think the textbook example of a global rule of 3 industry would be the global tire business. But before I tell more about it, let me pose a challenge to the audience. So I have a question. Which tire maker historically has been the most innovative one? So arguably the most innovative tire maker in the history of the industry. So think about it. Maybe whoever types the correct answer in chat box first, we can give them a copy of the book. I don't know if that's possible. And let me give some clues. So this company was founded in 1870 in Akron, Ohio, which arguably is the tire capital in the world. By arguably, again, I mean, I know it is true, but others can argue otherwise. And then this company in late 1800s founded the first research lab of the industry of anyone. This company came up with the first rubber reclamation process, which became the standard of the industry. In fact, the tires of this company was on the plane of Charles Lindbergh when he flew over the Atlantic for the first time. So the Spirit of St. Louis was the name of his plane. The tires were made by this company. And when later Charles Lindbergh complained that he was worried about icing as he was flying over, this company came up with the first de-icing mechanism, which was adopted on his plane later. This company invented synthetic rubber, which was key for the US war effort, because during World War II, US was cut off from the natural rubber supplies. So without this company, the war may not have been won. This company invented the tubeless tire. In fact, when NASA started sending astronauts to space, they contracted this company to build the spacesuits that the astronauts wore. So I don't know what answers we got. If you basically guess Goodyear, you would be wrong. But if anybody typed in BF Goodrich, you would be right. So BF Goodrich.
Okay.
And
Okay.
interestingly, however, BF Goodrich also recognized, so when Michelin came in with the radial tire innovation, then of course the competitive war in the United States market got very intense. There is Goodyear historically, then there was Firestone, and when the two got in competitive war, price wars, BF Goodrich found itself in the ditch, even though it was the most innovative number 3 player, as the Professor Sheth mentioned. So BF Goodrich struggled for a while, as innovative as it is, it couldn't get out of the ditch organically. So, and they reconsidered, they figured out that their core competency was not tire manufacturing, it is specialty chemicals. So, and by the way, the margins in the tire business are very thin. It's about 2 to 3 to 4% in OEM business, very low and very competitive business. In fact, one of the founders of the tire manufacturer said the Detroit wants their tires black, round, and cheap, and they don't really care if they're black or round. So that's why basically they were really going for lower and lower prices, eating into the margins. So BF Goodrich said, why am I even bothering with this? So they actually exited, they divested the tire side of the business, sold to Michelin. And the brand still exists today, but it is owned by Michelin essentially. And BF Goodrich became gradually a pure aerospace player. They grew, and in 2012, when actually United Technologies bought them, acquired them, their market cap was 6 times the size of Goodyear. They started from a fraction of Goodyear, and when they exited about 2.5 decades later, they had 6 times the cap of Goodyear. But let me come back, of course. So Michelin comes into the United States, but of course, Japan has Bridgestone, which then acquired Firestone, who had quality problems, couldn't adapt to the radial revolution. So that was the formation of the rule of 3 in the United States, and then also globally. So right now we have Bridgestone #1, we have Michelin #2, and Goodyear's #3. But we actually have a chapter at the end of the book where we make, of course, predictions for the future of different industries. We think that, for example, Apollo from India might as well challenge Goodyear in the next decade. And they already own Cooper Tire of United States, by the way. Apollo owns it. Another competitor could be ZC from China. China could also be a major force in the future. And so this is a dynamic rule, but it is very much predictive of the future.
That's terrific. That was very, very interesting. Some of the stories. I don't know if someone got the right answer. Rahul can tell us. And,
I think somebody did. Yes.
Oh, terrific.
Zubin did that.
Okay, terrific. That's great. Congratulations, Zubin. I'm conscious of the time, so Professor Sheth and Raj I'll come to you as well. Very quickly, I know the book has many other industries where you found the same phenomena really playing out, the global rule of 3. Do you want to kind of pick up one each of your favorite examples and just spend a minute very quickly telling us what to look for when people read the book? Professor Sheth first. Yeah, or Raj.
Oh, okay.
Raj,
Raj, you go.
Okay. Well, there are so many, right? I mean, the book is full of these stories, and the stories are so interesting and quite dramatic, actually. So, you know, business is a place of high drama. So the one that that I think everybody originally associates with the big 3 is the auto industry.
That's right.
That's where the big 3 came into the language. In a way, people thought of General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler as the original big 3. And that was thought to be the exception, but as Jag has shown, that is actually the rule. And so if you look at how that evolved, you know, the auto industry in the early part of the last century started, as most industries do, with a bunch of different people trying to come up with their own designs and their own standards and their own ways of doing things. So there were literally hundreds, as many as 500 startups, car companies that existed at one point. And each one of them had its own unique way. You couldn't, if you drove one car, it didn't mean you were able to drive another car because they were so different. So then, of course, what you needed was some standardization and some degree of efficiency because there was no economies of scale the way it was happening. So that's a formula for rapid consolidation and exit. So a lot of those companies, of course, die, right? So over a 30-year period, that 300 literally went down to 3. And you had GM, Ford, and Chrysler that emerged. And then you had some specialists like AMC and Studebaker and others. And at that time, it was really a national level industry. There was not a lot of globalization that happened. But that started to happen more, especially in the 60s and 70s when the Japanese started to recover from World War II and started to come in with their smaller, more efficient cars. And then the fuel crises of the 1970s really raise that to a much larger segment in the market. So Toyota and Honda started to come in. That's in a way those tires from Bridgestone, et cetera, came into the US through those cars as OEM. And so then you started to see shifts happening in the structure. And you started to see initially a pattern emerge where we had the big three in the US. The European market, since it was not integrated at that time, typically tended to have a rule of four. You typically had the big three. You had Germany, you had France, you had England, and then you might have a fourth player from either Italy or Spain or one of the other countries, right? So you had GM, Ford, Chrysler, you had Renault, Peugeot, Daimler-Benz, Fiat, Volkswagen, etc. And then, of course, in Asia, you had Toyota, Nissan, and Honda that were coming up. And then as the globalization started to increase and you saw a lot of cross-border mergers, Chrysler was always in precarious position. One of the fundamentals of the theory is that those who are closest to the ditch are the most likely to fall into the ditch from either side. So number three is a precarious existence, and the larger specialists are in a precarious existence because they're losing their specialty nature by becoming too large. And rule of three, on the other side, they can't compete on scale with the bigger volume players. So Chrysler was always going in and out of bankruptcy as a result of that, and ultimately they had to look for a merger partner. So they've gone through multiple mergers, as we know, with Daimler and others. So yeah, so that's how the pattern is evolving. And right now we have a certain pattern, but again, as in the book, speculation about how it's going to evolve with the rise of electric cars and Tesla and that whole technology shift. The technological revolution sort of reshuffles the deck, and then of course certain Chinese brands also emerging.
Yeah, so that you kind of brings me, Raj, to the next. There's a question that I thought might be useful to raise now, because both of you have given what I would call old economy examples, auto and tires. What happens when the sectors start evolving into ecosystems? And I wanted to pick up the question asked by Thomas X. Schmidt. He's asked, how does the rule of three apply in sectors where companies are becoming ecosystems, such as Apple, Google, and Amazon? Are they the three? Professor Sheth, do you want to take that?
Sure, absolutely. Rule of three prevails at a platform level, where platform becomes the ecosystem essentially. So you already see platform level happening in ride sharing, like Uber type companies. And there'll be worldwide consolidation because each country starts their own Uber counterpart. So Uber will basically become one of the dominant players as it begins to do merger acquisitions and consolidations. Let me tell you, the platform companies are emerging clearly in the cell phone business. And you see two platforms right now, but a third will evolve from a specialty to a generalist. We think it'll happen out of China more so than out of America. You have the Android platform. You, of course, have the Apple platform. I'm watching more interestingly the next thing, what is happening. Every industry is going to go for shakeout mergers. Streaming is the biggest change right now. And again, you'll see three major platforms in streaming surviving. Either they have a technology advantage or a content advantage, one or the other. We are watching that right now. So I think in the new industries coming in, the ecosystem concept is better in the following way. And I did a lot of work on this one for Texas Instruments, by the way. The notion is that at one time we believed in the industrial age, vertical integration is good for you. You invent, you design, you make, you sell, and you service it. In the new system, it says licensing is a better opportunity. You invent something and immediately you license the work to create what we call a de facto standard, which is what Android did very well at Google, which is where Google does very well in the search engines in many ways. Rather than block out the competitor, you basically co-opt with them. So it's a cooperative, competition with cooperation kind of stuff. So we are watching that a new paradigm may emerge where the licensing may become more mainstream industry, which is very much like collecting royalties, subscription, etc. And that may be the key model that may emerge in the future. So ecosystems, same phenomenon will happen. You will have the large three major ones. As we see right now in terms of social media, you see Facebook, you see, of course, Instagram, you see WhatsApp, You see many others coming in. WeChat, for example, out of China. They're all trying to make a global play. More interestingly, you see LinkedIn as a specialty.
Right.
And there are many more specialty coming in. So it's the same pattern, no matter what you look at the
Very
ecosystem level. Yeah.
There's
If
another
I may,
go
let
on
me
further.
quickly add one more example. We
Sure.
discussed the tires, then Raj brought in the automotive. Let me give a contemporary example that uses both. So food delivery platforms, right?
Yeah.
So this is basically 5 years old. This sector, this entire food delivery is 5 years old, but the rule of three is already here. So we have DoorDash in the United States, 45% market share. We have Grubhub, 23% market share. And then Uber Eats, the food delivery arm of Uber, is 22% market share. However, Uber Eats just announced last summer that they are going to acquire Postmates, which was another company, and they had 8% share. So when you combine the two, Uber Eats gets to 30%, so you'll have 45, 30, and 22, which is an excellent illustration of the rule of three structure, as well as the market share distributions that would be expected. And all of this happened in the frame of 5 years, actually. So, and that's a platform example also.
Yeah.
Okay, IG, I see a good question from my friend Vinay Gupta, who, by the way, invested early. When he read the book, he created an investment portfolio, and he made more money out of that than I think Jag or I did. But his question is, if the third player is the most innovative, then at some stage, number three should become number one or number two, as innovation would create sufficient value to upstage number one or number two. However, we don't see that. And what prevents that? So that's one of the very interesting phenomena here. Jag, if you would like to.
Sure. The main reason why number three does not jump up to number one is that the number one and number two duplicate them very quickly. What I call the fast follower strategy as a defensive mechanism.
Right.
And because they have more market access, they're able to copy what number three invented and take the market away, like RC Cola at one time we talked about. So you watch number three and what number one, number two does essentially. That's clearly one reason why it does not happen. It did happen in some industries that I saw, where number three became number one pretty much, because the number one, number two were not adapting or changing to the internal competition. They were watching something else. Go ahead, Raj.
I think Walmart was a great example of that, right? They were highly innovative.
Absolutely.
Kmart
Absolutely.
and Target, I think, at the top did not respond adequately.
So Raj,
Absolutely.
thanks for spotting that question. It's a lovely one. There was one more from Vamesh Chovatia, and he's making the point about these illustrations in the case studies that you talk about are post-factual, they're post-mortem really. But if you were to look at it from an investing lens, right, how would you use this template for professionals who are in the investing business to recognize who will end up in the ditch and who will thrive? I think it's a very interesting question. I thought one of you could take it.
I think from an investing lens, there are three separate opportunities. The biggest opportunity is really mergers, acquisitions of very large scale across borders. Auto industry still is in the process of getting rule of three on a global level. So right now, Volkswagen dominates as number one. You have Toyota number two as a group. Then there's a whole drop now. We don't know whether GM can survive or Ford can survive without consolidation. So if you have big boys like Goldman Sachs or, those very large scale merger acquisition people, clearly it gets you into merger acquisitions as a field, any industry. Second one is the other extreme where there may be always a new technology, especially an internet digital technology like fintech, generates opportunity for somebody who will coexist as a niche player. So venture capital market is very good for that. In fact, in India, IDG Ventures that Sudhir Sethi started identified those niche companies who are almost transformative in many ways, like Myntra or Flipkart, for example, etc. In a place where, so that's clearly second major area. The third one is the most interesting one. There are so many players in the ditch in an industry change that takes place. And how can you take all the ditch dwellers and put them together, take them out of the ditch?
Consolidate.
And usually it's a way of what I do advising a roll-up strategy. As a private equity guy, you pick up one of those companies good management there probably, and you make sure that in a very quick succession, you begin to acquire more and more ditch dollars, which are very much bottom of the barrel, kinds of valuations. You can pick up quite a lot and you rationalize them properly. And either reposition them as a niche player on the left side of the curve in our chart, or become one of the generalists in the process. As Uber Eats just did, as John just mentioned, for example. So those are the three key merger acquisition opportunities right away in every industry. And the other one, of course, is where the industry starts, as Raj mentioned, in automobile. Right now it's happening in streaming services. There'll be many companies jumping in. There's a shakeout merger that takes place. In shakeout merger, you also have M&A activity.
Terrific. That's so useful to know. Jaya tells us that Vamesh is the CEO and the MD of Tata Healthcare Investment, which is great to know.
Yeah.
Thanks, Vamesh, for that question. I want to move the conversation forward to our last section because I'm conscious of the time as well. And it's an important section where a lot of people who are joining are leaders in business and academia, and understanding the implications of your work will be very useful. And I want to pick up the question that Sridhar has asked, which is that there are many examples of your study, and what you've talked about is US centric, but both you and Raj, Professor Sheth, have done work on emerging multinationals. Chindia and all your work around globalization is significant. So he asks, how do you see the role of Southeast Asia, China, and MENA play in the coming decades? What would it mean for leaders? And you've been on the Wipro board as well for so many years, and associated with G, which is something that he has asked as well, saying that does the rule of three apply to a G? So both ends of the spectrum, people joining from the US will be interested. What do multinationals have? What sort of a play do they have in these markets, in our markets here? And multinationals, Indian multinationals like Wipro, what can they now do? And what are you finding?
Clearly, in the new global rule of three, sees the three largest markets, especially consumer markets, are China number one on purchasing power parity basis in terms of GDP, US number two, and the third one, of course, is India. India is pretty big in terms of markets. So we believe that rule of three will end up in terms of one company from India, one company from China, one company from America. India is a more strategic and less likely, but one from China. And here are the key examples. Lenovo today is like number one, number two in PC business, competing with HP. So here is an emerging economy that has done very well. Higher in appliances, number three, GE sold it to Haier, for example, the appliance part of the business. I can give you about a dozen examples from China where the number one or number two company actually is. To me, Alibaba will be a global player. It's a matter of time, wherever they are allowed to by law, essentially. And Alibaba is much stronger than Amazon in terms of its capabilities, for example. They do kinds of things that we have not even imagined possible. WeChat, another platform, the same way. I can give you an example. So clearly one. Out of India, many of the basic industries we are doing very well. So if you take the Aditya Birla Group, it is already number one in carbon black. In flat aluminum sheet as a subcategory of aluminum, not aluminum production, but value add on aluminum ingots, as they call it, it is almost number one or number two through the Novelis acquisition in America, which added about $11-12 billion. In India, the same thing is happening within India in the retailing sector, especially with Flipkart now coming in properly, Amazon competing, and the third one might be Reliance now, it looks like, one can easily see the articulation. So I think rule of three on a global level means that emerging markets, multinationals will become global, not just India and China, by the way, but you take Mexico, Grupo Bimbo actually owns more flour mills in North America than anybody else, which is the largest market. You take a Brazilian company, which is really a 3G essentially, buying out both beer companies, two biggest beer companies in America, Budweiser and Miller. Miller was bought out by SAB from South Africa, and then they merged together, and interestingly. So Budweiser is gone, Kirin beer is gone out of, out of Japan, for example. These are all large companies. So it basically says that the emerging markets will emerge as one of the top 3 players. What happens to, so clearly, and I can go on, but we can just stop here.
Sure. So I wanted to kind of bring in John, and I know, Raj, you have another commitment. So at some stage, you just let us know. I know you have another meeting to attend. So we might go on for a few more minutes. So please feel free to let us know what works. So John, I wanted to bring you in the global rule of 3. What does it mean for businesses that don't want to play in the global arena or want to just stay local and regional?
Right. So they always have the option to be healthy, viable specialists in their defined markets. They can be market specialists, they can be product specialists. And I'll give an example that everybody in the audience probably knows. Anybody with a business degree knows about Southwest Airlines. If you think about it, Southwest started as an intrastate carrier within Texas. Then after the regulation, they grew and became a national carrier. But they never, even though they are now number 2 in the United States, they never became an international carrier.
Right.
So they have some international flights, but you can go to Grand Bahamas, Nassau, Belize, the places you'd like to go for vacation, not business. But they don't have international flights to any commercial destinations. So they are basically a specialist at a global level, and they are doing very well. Another example from my home country, original home country, Yıldız Group is basically a food manufacturer, specializes in biscuits. It is currently the number 3 biscuit manufacturer in the world. Later, then they bought on chocolatier Godiva, that everybody may know of. They own Godiva chocolates. Then they bought United Biscuits to become number 3 in the world. And basically, therefore, after Mondelez and Kellogg, they are number 3, and they are competing also with another brand you might know, Parley. So in the biscuits markets, they are basically competing aggressively as a specialist. So that's another example. In the narrowly defined market, you can be a very successful specialist. But now, of course, Yıldız grew out of it. They now have global aspirations too. So they want to grow and become a generalist in some sense. So that can be, of course, a struggle to convert oneself from specialist to a full-line generalist is usually a challenging process.
No, this is very, very interesting. Raj, I'll come to you essentially around the, you spoke about the implications that the global rule of 3 has for leaders in business. You spoke a little about that. Would you like to kind of dwell a little more on how you see this kind of fundamentally changing in the way firms are led and managed going forward, and what the pandemic may have taught us, really, because it has exposed a lot of the fault lines. Some would argue that it's as much an opportunity.
Yeah, no, I don't necessarily see a link between leadership qualities and the rule of 3 per se, other than to know the context and understand where we are. I mean, the specialist has different needs than a generalist does. So from a leader standpoint, I mean, those are more sort of tactical dimensions, I would say. Okay. So I think the questions you're asking are more general, beyond the rule of 3.
Okay.
And I will have to leave in a few minutes.
Sure. Thank you so much.
But I want to thank you. And I want to thank everybody for attending. I think this was a lot of fun. I learn more every time I interact with Jagdish Sheth, and I learned a lot from John today as well. So thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you for joining us. Professor Sheth, there are quite a few other questions that I'll pick up. Dr. Jasween Kaur is asking about cartelization. How does cartelization really impact the play? And is it just about adoption of competitive strategies, or does understanding of how cartels work really impact the rule of 3?
Right. Surprisingly, cartels are legal in many parts of the world, especially in Europe, because the agreement was that you have the national resources, which are society's resources, and sharing those operations is good for you. So cartels, only place where they are really illegal or regulatory lens is put is mostly in the US. US monopoly laws, because of the abuse that was taking place, primarily blocking everybody else to come in. But we have a paper, Atul Parvatiyar, my colleague, and wrote a paper long ago on how cartels contribute value to the society.
He's
Opposite.
in fact with us
Yeah.
today.
So Atul and we wrote a paper about
Right.
in many operations like logistics, it
Right.
is good to share a common, it's a platform basically we call it,
Right.
no matter
Yeah.
who you are. In cigarette distribution, which is out of taboo now, for example, there is only one company that distributed cigarettes in the supermarkets, which was RJR Reynolds. So Marlboro cigarette guys, Philip Morris, British American Tobacco, all had to sell their things through their logistics system.
Right.
There's a common logistics system to share the cost. As it is true in dairy products right now in the US, for example, where Kraft Foods carries Kraft brand of cheese and whatever they carry, dairy products, but they also carry Borden, their competitor, etc. So it's not as uncommon. And I'm not that negative toward cartelization. It's a word that has been negatized by people by using it.
Yeah.
Our theory says, as John will also tell you, you really need optimally 3 players, which is called a cartel or oligopoly. I think economists malign oligopoly unnecessarily.
Right.
Because in many places, like India, in India, the biggest issue that I find is that we have the size of the market, but we have no scale. Because it's family-owned businesses. License Raj came in, would not allow you to have capacity that requires scale, for example. So you don't get the economies of procurement, as I mentioned earlier.
Sure.
In India, that's the biggest weakness. China reformed everything to allow large corporations to come in, either as state enterprises or as private sectors like Alibaba, Tencent, etc. So cartelization is a good idea, not a bad idea.
Yeah, Professor Sheth, there is a related question about from Knight, where person's asking, have antitrust laws impacted the rule of 3 in any way?
Yeah. There are 4 areas, 4 situations where rule of 3 doesn't emerge. First one is in partnerships. If a whole industry is organized as partnerships, like consulting business, for example, accounting business, you don't see the rule of 3. As soon as they go from partnership to a corporate ownership, like stock market, rule of 3 comes in, as it happened in ad agencies.
Yes.
You got 3 groups formed, clearly,
yes.
You could see. And then everybody else was a niche player, pretty much, either a market niche. So one is where the ownership is partnership rather than a investor-owned companies primarily. That's clearly one. So rule of 3 will be a long time coming in India because we have so many family owning their own businesses. And even if they may be listed on the stock market, the control is with the management, pretty much. So that's clearly one. Second one is that when you have a patent that doesn't allow anybody else to come in. You have a long-term patent in pharmaceutical, that's very common that you have a monopoly of one company because they invented. And the monopoly doesn't allow anybody else till the patent right goes away and becomes a generic, for example. The third one is where the government does not allow you primarily. So government has restrictions. It's a regulated market. Where the government, many countries are still not allowing full-blown competition, essentially. So rule of 3 doesn't prevail in many markets. I mean, we had a commanding heights theory where we believed private sector cannot own anything. So we have very large-scale the state enterprises in India.
Yes.
Very large in insurance industry, for example, LIC at one time. Now they've opened up general insurance, 3-4 companies. Now they've opened up, for example. So in that time, it is basically government dictated market. And the last one is that there are some regulated industries like utilities where you are saying that it is okay to have just one company. In fact, there is a whole theory in economics which I studied and I really advised on that, natural monopoly as they call it. A second player actually is a waste of society's resources. One railway track is fine kind of a notion, don't build 2 railway tracks, etc., which is sort of out of favor. So antitrust is shifting now its thinking, not looking at just economic theories, which are classical theories essentially, but more and more the newer theories coming in pretty much. So I think antitrust will have not as an impact.
Terrific. So I want to kind of, Professor Sheth, close with a question to both you and John, because there are lots of people who've joined who have an interest in research and building a research culture in India, and I'm sure in the US as well. And you've been a stalwart in terms of for the kind of career that you've had in belting out amazing piece of work, right? With such great consistency. And we're also, I think, facing the issue of how do you create a leadership development model that prepares future leaders for the world that we're kind of about to see. And COVID has certainly, I think, given us pause. So I wanted both of you to make your concluding remarks, maybe starting with John, and then we'll come to you, Professor Sheth, in terms of what are the big things that are emerging from your lens in terms of what it takes to build a research culture in management education, and about making it relevant and rigorous and shaping practice so that we have a new generation that really benefits from it. Can John, given your kind of vantage position at Rutgers and all that you've done, do you want to kind of come in?
So, of course, it's very important. Nowadays, I feel that many researchers have focused on incremental contributions over long-lasting fundamental contributions. That's something that we should try to overcome. So let me try to address it first as an individual researcher and then look at it at an institutional level quickly. So, I mean, being stuck in the middle as a researcher is a position I actually empathize with, right? So think about it. On one hand, we have Professor Sheth, the consummate generalist, the Renaissance man of academia. He basically knows everything that's about to be said in the business in general. And on the other hand, we have Raj Sisodia. He's focused on some very interesting topics. He's basically the Ferrari of conscious capitalism. So as a scholar stuck in the middle, what do you do? Of course, I could try to learn about different topics, become broader in my scope, right? It would take time. I could try to do this organically, but that will take a long time. But you should rather build coalitions, right? Research teams, essentially, that have strengths in different areas, so you can get strengths together and make the fundamental contribution that you couldn't be able to do otherwise individually. Of course, as a stuck in the middle researcher, your other option would be to downsize and specialize. Literally speaking, my wife would prefer the former because it might mean that I have more time for family and the kids, and I would also lose weight in the process through downsizing. But of course, that is the other option, that you can specialize in a narrowly defined research topic and make bigger contributions in that avenue of basically path. And as an institution, I think the choice is somewhat simple. You basically have to decide, are you a specialist or are you a generalist? So think about it. Our neighbor here, I'm in New Jersey, our specialist neighbor here is called Princeton University.
Yes.
The total enrollment at Princeton is about 7,000 to 8,000 students. My university is the State University of New Jersey. We have close to 80,000 students here. So it's a 10 times basically scale difference. And we have basically programs in every area you can think of, from the social sciences, the humanities, to the advanced topics, nanotechnologies, and so forth. We have everything you can think of. So then you have to act based on your strategic choice. If you're a specialist, you will make your decisions accordingly. If you're a generalist, you will make your investments accordingly. And talking about market share, if you're a generalist, unit share may be more important than revenue share for you, but is absolutely essential if you're a specialist that you should focus on your revenue share.
Terrific. No, that was brilliant. Professor Sheth, do you want to kind of talk about the business school of the future and what you see as some of the things that people ought to be thinking about? If you had a magic wand, what would you change?
Yeah, I think the fundamental change is to discard the old regulatory framework of how we evaluate educational institutions' contribution to the society and how individuals can contribute to the institution. We have a legacy of the British system. The British system legacy was that You have a University of Bombay, University of Madras, whatever they were in that time. And those universities level will be a few people doing research, and all the colleges belonging will be teaching colleges.
Right.
So the focus was on teaching and training either professional people like engineers, accountants is a very old technique, but the accountant goes back so many years. In the early days, every place accounting, commerce began to be evolved. I think the new thinking, it says that that is only the teaching role, and that can be delegated to junior colleges essentially. Can you become research oriented, and where the research is something that faculty is very interested in? So how do you create a culture of research primarily? And there are 2-3 mechanisms. One mechanism is that you have to have industry contribute toward capital for research. One of the biggest weaknesses in India is that we don't have corporations with strong R&D departments. When I was an advisor to Bell Labs or an advisor to Tech Center at General Motors, you have to see the scale of R&D investment in traditional industries, and now you can see the same in Silicon Valley. So in many ways, as we have new education policy coming in, the national education policy, allowing institutions to come in, their corporations have to come. One of the biggest things is these corporations generate Nobel Prize winners as good as any university. Okay? So keep that in mind. So I think we have to have that corporate R&D funding academics.
Absolutely.
Besides the government. And of course, now we have the National Research Foundation as a proposal. Government has to contribute to the academic institutions. So those are the 2 places where I see, in addition to philanthropy.
Yeah.
We often get philanthropists who simply say, I'm interested in that area, or you have the need, let me fund it. So funding becomes very key. Funding cannot be dependent on fees in India, or the tuition fees as we call it. So that's clearly one. Second thing is that our weakest link, unfortunately, is our doctoral education. In India, in management field, our doctoral education does not challenge to the level of top publication as the goal ultimately in a top academic journal. We allow something that's less than that. So how do we beef up our doctoral programs in India? Because we have the size, number of doctoral students involved in management alone, and I'm focusing on management. In engineering, it is happening a little better now. It is happening much better in chemistry and physics and theoretical physics, especially math and computer science. But how can we make our doctoral programs comparable to research-driven universities worldwide? That's very important.
That's right.
So to me, that will generate next generation of scholars who have begun their journey from a research perspective rather than from a teaching perspective. We can go on and on.
Yeah. Sure. No. I fully understand. This has been a fabulous conversation. Thank you both, and of course, Raj, for sharing your perspective. It's been brilliant. I mean, for me, it's been an enormous learning opportunity, and we have to thank the audience also for some very interesting questions. It's a privilege to have all of you join us and ask such great questions. I wish we had a little more time, but I think hoping that we can keep this pot boiling. These conversations don't need to end with a webinar. That's my experience been with Professor Sheth. He's always available on a call or an email, and he responds so promptly, even at, the energy is amazing. And John, it was a privilege, I think, listening to you and to the research that you're doing. And Raj as well, he's been a lightning rod in the whole conscious capitalism movement. And it's been—
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah. My last comment, buy the book, okay? It is Amazon #1 or #5, whatever it is, make it #1 for us.
Yes, absolutely.